For your ears only for the week of November 27th, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Melissa Axelberth.
We will stick to the timeline of parliamentary elections followed by presidential elections in June 2012. And then the military will return to its barracks, but only if the people want and only through a referendum.
To Tantawi, scared of God, and know that one day these people will be all against you and you will ask for their mercy.
Revolution revisited Cairo's Tahrir Square last week with tens and hundreds of thousands of demonstrators against continued military council rule that could shape upcoming elections, as declared by top General Mohammed Hussein Tantawi, though doubts remained. And Tantawi did not do much better with the protesters when he named another veteran of the displaced Mubarak regime as the new transitional prime minister. Washington, too, weighed in with strong warnings that longtime support for the military as a major force for stability in the region might be at risk if it did not quickly cede power to a civilian government reflecting the will of the people.
But what is that will? Polls show that a sizable portion of Egypt's 80 million people have more faith or at least familiarity with the military than the masses in Tahrir. And the generals make the same argument as Mubarak. Who will keep the peace if we surrender power? That is also the argument of President Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who last week defied an Arab League deadline to permit observers to monitor an end to bloody repression of protests there. Syria now faces the loss of League membership and potentially paralyzing new economic sanctions.
To consider all those events, their impact on the region and the wider world for your ears only, we're joined now by Dr. Yossef, a postdoctoral fellow at New York University's Taub Center for Israel Studies, and an adjunct professor of political science at the American University in Cairo. Welcome to our program.
Welcome, David. Good morning.
What is your sense of how much support the Tahrir protest really has around the country?
I would first want to differentiate between two types of requests that the Tahrir protesters have. The first type is reforms, meaning stopping military trials of civilians, cleaning the state bureaucracy, particularly the Ministry of Interior, of the old regime personalities, and preventing members of the Mubarak's National Democratic Party from running into elections. The second type is the immediate transition of power to a civilian government, meaning essentially the resignation of the military council. I would say that the Tahrir protest obviously has a wide support among the Egyptian population on the first type of the quest, that is the reforms. But for the second type, there are doubts whether they have the majority of Egyptians standing for the request of an immediate transition of power to either a transitional presidential council or a national salvation government headed by the same by some personality chosen by the Tahrir protesters. On the one hand, the majority of Egyptians who wants to get back to normalcy would support the government of Kemal al-Ganzouri, who, though having been served under Mubarak before, has a reputation of independence, which has actually led to having him being fired by Mubarak in 1999. Remember that also acting Prime Minister Assam Sharaf, who himself has been elected by the Tahrir protesters earlier in March, has also served as a minister under Mubarak. On the other hand, it's unclear how the Presidential Council or the National Salvation Government would have the legitimacy to rule and deal with the military and police forces at a time when the security situation is getting worse all over the country, which requires even more strict measures to protect lives and property. Legitimacy comes with representations, meaning elections. That requires sticking to the clear roadmap that allows timely legislative elections to be held on its scheduled time by the end of this month. There are reports that elections might be held, but still, it is part of this roadmap, and the Egyptian people certainly need a start. That election should be followed by presidential elections which position Egypt on a stable path toward democratic transition.
Many protesters want elections delayed, so there's time to make them more democratic, and we read there's even division among the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, which is best organized and prepared for early voting. How do you see those divisions playing out?
I think the earlier doubts over the extent to which the elections should be democratic have been cleared by two decisions of the military. First, adopting what the majority of political forces required of an essentially partyless proportional representation system. And the second is issuing a law depriving those figures of the National Democratic Party of Mubarak from running into elections. I think protesters want elections to be delayed so that there is time to get the liberal forces get more organized. But this also runs the risk of either continuing the military rule for an indefinite period of time all getting counter-protests by the Islamists who want the elections to be held right now. These protests could turn into violent ones by the Islamic forces, and the anarchy that's going on in the Egyptian street could go on for indefinite of time.
How important is continued military control to Egypt's commitment to peace with Israel and its influence on the always explosive Israeli-Palestinian relations?
I think the military leadership, coherent and rational as it is, recognizes Egypt's national interest in maintaining peace with Israel. And it has been instrumental, actually, in reassuring its commitment when Mubarak stepped down. However, that does not mean that a civilian government, even one that has a significant portion of Islamists inside, would reverse the peace with Israel. Not only has the Muslim Brotherhood and the other Islamic forces moderated their positions towards Israel, but also the presidential office would likely go to the secular and moderate candidate Amr Moussa, who has been a former minister in the 90s, who holds on as the forerunner for president with almost 30% of the vote, more than double his closest competitor. That was according to a recent poll by the International Peace Institute. So I would say that maintaining peace with Israel does not necessarily need a continued control of the military, but let's say that they would have a significant say in the new political process.
How do you see Israel trying to influence or prepare for the changing power dynamics in Egypt? And what do you think Israel should be doing?
I think Israel has made the wrong approach. Israel appears to adopt the analogy of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. I believe this analogy is misplaced as it overlooks the significant differences between the two cases, particularly the role of the military and the relative strength of the anti-Israel camp, as I said earlier. Israel should now engage the Egyptian transitional government instead of acting on Netanyahu's futile wait-and-see approach. Some of the immediate steps to heal the relations should include fully restoring the Israeli diplomatic mission in Cairo that has been attacked in early September, as long as security is assured, and openly supporting the Arab general outcry for freedom while being positive in its narrative about the Egyptian transition. Israel has recently apologized over the accidental killing of Egyptian policemen on the border. This would certainly help improve the relations. But any Israeli government, especially the current one, should stop creating more enemies in this neighborhood. While the Muslim Brotherhood may well become a significant player in Egypt, Israel should not automatically designate the party as a natural enemy, especially when they recognize, the Muslim Brotherhood, they recognize that their takeover of Egypt runs against the country's interests. It would also be strategically important for Israel to use its influence in Washington and other major capitals to support the continued economic assistance to Egypt by the international community. That is in order to ensure that economic development, which is the key to nurturing democratic reforms, go hand in hand.
Dr. Amr Yossef is a post-doctoral fellow at New York University's Taub Center for Israel Studies and an adjunct professor of political science at the American University in Cairo.
Quote from the news, blatant and unacceptable. That was Pakistan's Army Chief, General Ashfaq Kayani, on a misdirected NATO helicopter and jet raid that killed 24 Pakistani border troops, injured more than a dozen others, and led Islamabad again to block supply routes to U.S.-led forces in Afghanistan.
And here's another quote. Better than anyone would have dreamed. That was J. Peter Pham, director of the Africa program at the Atlantic Council in Washington, on the success of African Union peacekeepers in Somalia, or at least in the war-torn capital of Mogadishu.
Next, the U.S. deficit debacle, defense, and the presidential race for your ears only.